And welcome back to another podcast with Mr. Hagan. And on this Econ podcast, we want to finish our discussion about the scientific method. And we said in the last video that economics is kind of a science in the sense that we make assumptions, we pretend things are true, even if they're not, to help us isolate variables and make a hypothesis. My hypothesis was if you decrease the price of cars, people will buy more cars, assuming that there's no change in incomes. And then we could collect data and test if that is true. Now, I want to say two last things in this video about this. The first one is this word right here, this term right here, ceteris paribus. The assumption that we often make when we create an economic model is the assumption of ceteris paribus, which means, ceteris paribus means everything else held constant. Everything else held constant. So we're good. Sometimes we're going to use the assumption that everything else in the world is held constant. So not just people's incomes, we're going ceteris paribus, people's incomes are held constant, but not just their incomes, everything else. The price of mopeds, everything else that you could imagine that could affect the number of cars that are bought, we're going to assume that it's held constant. So that the only thing that can change is the price of cars. You see, again, we can't do these controlled experiments, but we're going to try to kind of replicate them in a way. We're going to kind of pretend that we're doing controlled experiments so that we can hold everything else constant and only change one variable at a time. Change the price of cars. How does that change the number of cars that people are going to purchase? And then collect data to check if that's true. So I would say this, I'd make this statement. I'd say if you get a decrease in the price of the cars, people will buy more cars, ceteris paribus. Everything else held constant, holding constant the price of a motorcycle, holding constant the price of a moped, holding constant people's income, holding everything else constant. If the price of cars goes down, people will buy more, and then we collect data to try to show that that's true. Now, I want to say one last thing about this before concluding this video, and that is that when we make these assumptions up at the beginning, that oftentimes can be more of an art form than a science. Okay, it can be more art than science. So, for example, if we're going to drop an object from the top of a building, if we want to drop an object from the top of a building and we want to predict a model to build a model to predict velocity. So I'm going to try to come up with some model, some probably mathematical model that's going to predict the velocity of the object as it falls. The question is, what should be my assumptions? What assumptions should I make when I build that model? Well, should we assume that there's no air resistance? Well, if I'm going to drop a feather, then sure, I could. If I'm going to drop a feather off of the building, then it's probably a bad idea to assume there's no air resistance, because the air resistance would have a lot of influence on that feather and how quickly it falls to the ground. So if I'm going to talk about a feather, if that's going to be the thing that I'm studying, then I better include air resistance in that model. Okay? But let's on the other hand say, what if the object that I'm dropping is a bowling ball? All right, well then no air resistance, that might be a pretty good assumption. A little bit of wind probably isn't going to do very much to the bowling ball, and so I can make the assumption that there's no air resistance. My point is this. What assumptions that we make is a little bit of an art form. It's a little bit of a guessing game. It's a little bit of opinion. And some people, may disagree on what assumptions we make. Let me say this to finish up this this podcast, making assumptions is really important in economics. And if you want to argue against an economist, go after his assumptions. Go after his assumptions, because the assumptions, the whole rest of their model is going to be built on the assumptions that they have made. So whenever we study an economic model and we want to determine if it's a good model, we need to go back and look at the assumptions that they were making when they built the model. Thanks for joining me on another Econ podcast. I will see you. This has been Mr. Hagan, and I'll see you on the next podcast.